Greetings, friends. My name is Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the Jewish Publication Society, and I'm here today with two colleagues. Samuel Kessler, who holds an endowed chair in Jewish studies and is an assistant professor of religion at Gustavus Adolphus College, and George Kohler, who's an associate professor in the Department of Jewish Philosophy and the director of the Joseph Carlebach Institute for Jewish Theology at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. And most importantly for us today, they are the editors of this wonderful new JPS book that you see right here. It was just published at the end of last year, entitled Modern Jewish Theology, The First 100 Years, 1835 to 1935. And for those of you who haven't yet read it, it's really quite breathtaking, both historically and theologically. It's part of our Anthologies of Jewish Thought series, and it represents the first comprehensive collection of Jewish theological ideas from the pathbreaking 19th and early 20th centuries. Much of this material has never before been translated into English. And it encompasses a range of topics from the kind of nature and relevance of Judaism to the origins of what's often known as ethical monotheism to the possibility of Jewish existentialism. Professor Kessler, Professor Kohler, thank you for taking the time to speak and think together today, and more importantly, for putting together this wonderful collection.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. So as I just shared, the title and subtitle of your book promise to open up what you describe as the neglected first 100 years of something called modern Jewish theology. Similarly, if we look at the book's introduction, it promises to chart the emergence of what you describe as a modern, systematic, academically informed discipline of Jewish theology. And it promises to do that even though lots of people doubt whether there actually is such a thing as modern Jewish theology. What do you mean here? What do you have in mind when you refer to modern Jewish theology? And why do some people doubt that such a thing exists?
I'll let you start off, George.
Don't ask me why other people doubt that it exists. It's just, as you know, as much as I'm, thinking about it, I really, once I knew the answer today, I'm really not sure anymore. But obviously, I mean, there's a fear of, being compared or being close to Christianity. This is maybe the most frequently cited reason for that, and this really kind of funny idea that Judaism is actually about deeds. A good Jew is somebody who keeps the Shabbos day and eats kosher, and that is all you need to do. And if you think about it, it's just like really continuing a really very old anti-Semitic trope, that starts with St. Paul, actually, and goes through Luther to Kant, until this day, that Judaism is what is called works righteousness, right? I mean, like, you have to do something, but you don't have to believe anything. You don't have to have any motivation for that. You don't have to have any belief for that. And that is actually the answer of, for your question is modern Jewish theology is the attempt to find the underlying reasons for doing that, for doing those deeds. Of course, Judaism is much more than Christianity, a religion about deeds in our point of view, but there has to be something behind it, that where the nice German word Gesinnung is, always used, because it can't be translated into anything. It's just kind of a motivation that has to do with something that is inside the person. So that is to describe this underlying layer of, I wouldn't say belief, but, it's something that, Jewish theology has actually two enemies on both sides of the story. The one is religious philosophy, which it is not, right? And on the other side, there's this, articles of faith stuff, that things you have to believe, this is theology. So theology in itself is something that is in the middle, and it is modern in our point of view because it is again, I'm sorry for the German, but there is no word in English. So it's a Wissenschaft, it's a science. It's an academic approach to religion. So it's neither just culturally describing what is belief, nor is it religious philosophy. It's exactly the thing in the middle between the two. Very briefly.
Yeah. And just to build off that, I mean, one of the things we tried to show both in the introduction and in the notes was that Jews have been talking in a theological vein and often talking to others, especially Christians and Muslims, who have been doing theology in a more, let's say, overt manner. We tried to show that both in the notes and in the introduction that this is actually a long conversation. Jews have been talking theologically and trying to find that middle ground, right, between dogma and doctrine and just philosophy since really the Middle Ages. And then in the modern period, one of the things both George and I are just love the 19th century. And so one of the reasons that we love the 19th century, though, is because it is distinct, right? So there are a couple of sort of big events that happen early and into the middle of the 19th century, which is why we sort of start in 1835, which is a sense of suddenly Jews, and especially people on the rabbinical track, are allowed and are motivated and are encouraged to go to universities to get what we now think of as sort of modern PhDs, this notion that you're doing academic scholarly research, you're interested in historical sources, you're interested in the way that texts come about. You're not afraid, right? You're not only not afraid, you're excited about what archaeology and geography and zoology are finding, especially about the biblical period and the Near East. And then what you want to do is you want to say, I just have this incredible core faith that Judaism is robust enough to not shy away from whatever zoology has to say and whatever geology has to say about the Near East. I just can't. Why would any Jew live in a world in which they're afraid that Judaism wouldn't stack up against the most interesting things the earth has to offer? I mean, if the earth is the Lord's, right, then Judaism has to embrace that. And so what we really saw, and sort of coming from two different angles into the 19th century, was that suddenly there were all of these people, really interesting thinkers, who were engaged in this process of trying to find a way to bring together all the stuff they really loved about Judaism and their Jewish identities and their Jewish, the kinds of Jewish education I think most Americans could only dream of ever having, and then the sense of like really loving what they're learning in the university, even just the history of philology. How did Hebrew come to be, right? How does these languages come to be formed? What lies below the thing in which we sort of see on the surface, and bring those together and say, Judaism has something to say about this, and it reflects on how Jews understand God.
So that's so interesting. Both of you, I think, have touched on two kinds of themes. There's the kind of question of why it's so important to push back against this idea that there isn't something called Jewish theology on the one hand, and the idea that there's something particularly intriguing, not just about Jewish theology writ large, but about this particular moment that you recover in the book. And maybe we can sort of take each of those in turn. So you said a little bit about why you think there is something called modern Jewish theology. Why is it important to make that case? What do you see as being sort of at stake in insisting that there is something called Jewish theology, something called modern Jewish theology?
The modern part is really about the academic treatment of it, as Sam said, but there has always been Jewish theology. I mean, this is not something that was invented. You read this in secondary literature today very often, that there's something that is invented, especially in connection with Christianity. I don't think it's true. If you only think about, the Talmudic tractate of Avodah Zarah, deals with idolatry. I mean, where's the deed? This is something, the Talmudic rabbis defined what is inside, what is outside Judaism. So that is a project of theology, which is kind of pure, If you think about messianism, also very much discussed in the Talmudic, text. This is theology. I mean, this is, of course, then Middle Ages. Maimonides writes his book and he gets, criticism from all over the place, So what do they criticize? How he puts on his tefillin? No, they criticize exactly his views on theology. So that is, and it continues into the modern period. This is almost people who say it's only deeds are the first to always come out with, theological discussions the moment it gets serious. There's this strange story about Heinrich Gretz taken to court in Vienna in the 1860s for a wrong view on Messianism. Okay, so you have like 100 Orthodox rabbis signing a petition against this view, that there is only a personal view in Judaism. This is pure theology. And this is, I mean, that's the one thing, we really have to, admit that, we deal with the modern period, but it always has been, and it is also there in the modern period. There's no doubt about it that, that exactly what people deny, to be is a basic part of Judaism. That's why it's so interesting. Now, what is happening in the modern period is that you suddenly, at least in Western Europe and the United States, you have a lot of Jews who don't care so much, for observing the commandments anymore. But interestingly enough, they still want to be Jews. They're very proud to be Jews. They want to identify as Jews. So then this is where, those theologians that we have in the book come in and say, look, we offer you an alternative way to identify as Jews. There are certain beliefs that are really typical, that only exists actually in Judaism: strict monotheism, like future-oriented messianism, things like that, that offer a new way, a different way to identify as a Jew, not in a sense of belief, but in a sense of, if you think, like this, then you can still be Jewish without, keeping every single commandment. That is something that is actually causing this modern Jewish theology to emerge, to come into existence. And then on the other hand, of course, there's this really urgent need to demarcate, Judaism from Christian theology, because then it gets very close in the modern age. There's no doubt about it. Modern Protestant cultural theology is very close to what, the first Reform rabbis come up with. And they, of course, feel this need to say, we are still different. We still have a justification for continued existence of Judaism. So this is something that is forcing it to come into existence. On the other hand, of course, there are heavy debates, around emancipation of the Jews in the modern age, where a lot of Christian thinkers say, oh, look, we like you Jews, but, you have this strange belief, and you don't eat with us, you don't marry our wives, you don't marry our daughters, you just you're just out of it, you don't belong, you have this strange religion, and as long as you don't let go, then there's no way, to grant you emancipation. And then the Jews have to answer that, they have to tell them what actually, is Judaism, and this is not, and the answer that they, cannot give is Jews eat kosher and keep Shabbat. They have to come up with something that is what we think theology. So that are the two things that I see as, an internal reason in terms of identification, and this external reason in terms of, just discussing with Christianity what Judaism is really about, not those are the two factors actually that cause it to emerge in the early 19th century.
Absolutely. And just to build on that, one of the things I'm sure early modernists who, always think their period is the best, and medievalists always think their period is the best. But one of the things that the 19th century, us in the modern period, is that there's just this incredible flowering of answers, right, to the questions that George is posing, right? And one of the wonderful things, I've been working with George for a long time, and that one of the things that he said many, many years ago that stuck out to me, that's been really guiding, is this sense of, is the critique of the Orthodox against the Reform really is a theological critique. They're really not that worried about what food they're eating, or whether or not they're putting on their tallis every morning and their tefillin. Like, they're just not that worried about it, right? Are they making their tzitzit in exactly the right way? Are they kosher tzitzit? That's just not a concern, right? It's not even a concern if you listen to modern Israeli media today. That's just really not a Haredi concern with Tel Aviv, is whether or not they're tying their tzitzit correctly. It's the overarching vision of how you should live your life, what Jews believe, what they care about. One of the things we see in the 19th century, right, is as Jews become more integrated into European and of course on this side of the continent, this side of the ocean, in American society, there's just this abundance of possible answers, right? As we see, like, Jewish ethics becomes closer and closer to sort of Christian ethics in the sense of sort of universalizing principles of justice and fairness, of populations that live near each other, of non-discrimination, things which are all 19th century concepts. And as there's at a sort of, let me say it differently. One of the ways that we see Jews differentiating themselves before modernity is to say, well, we think all people are created equal, and we think, right, that there is a universality to law, and the Christians like, no, we have the answer. We are different. We are distinct. And into the 19th and 20th centuries, we start to get, this what now is sort of the dominant, I would say, the dominant discourse amongst all liberal, lowercase l liberal democracies, which is that everyone is created equal. Everyone has a unique spot, and everyone is an equal citizen. And so as Jewish sort of visions of the world get closer and closer to Christians, then we also see this, as George said, this need to distinguish. So what is distinct about Jews, right? What actually makes, why continue to be Jewish in a world in which, as most liberal Jews would say, non-Jews are completely moral, just in the way Jews are moral, right? Jewish and non-Jewish morality in a modern liberal society are pretty much identical. And so why then, what is the impetus for Judaism? And then it falls onto a theological question, right? Because it's not, well, Christians don't put on tefillin and we put on tefillin. Nobody puts on tefillin, right? And so the question then is, so what makes us distinct? And the book just really, I think, helps for students and for professors and for just sort of interested people to lay out just this incredible abundance of answers, right? There is a particular monotheistic bent to Judaism that you don't get in Christianity. There's a particular peoplehood bent that you don't get in Christianity or in Islam. There is a particular kind of engagement with a God who has unique responsibilities for each and every individual that you don't get with Christianity. So trying to come up with some of these answers that continue to make Judaism distinct from Christianity, but that don't rely on halakha, that don't rely on the legal answers that had at some level really sustained a great deal of just kind of Jewish discourse for so many centuries.
So on a little bit more systematic level, what we believe is that, or what we try to do in the book is to say that theology is something that is equivalent to one religion. There's religious philosophy that talks about God, providence, and big questions that are relevant for all religions. And theology, there is no general theology. There's Jewish theology or Christian theology. That is our working definition that we went with, and it is still a philosophical approach only to this one religion. And of course, theology assumes that the theo in theology, that there is to put it carefully, there is a way to talk about God. So that is an interesting subject, that even academically you can talk about God. What is behind this idea? Okay, so that is an assumption that philosophy not necessarily has. You just can deny this idea or whatever. And then on the other hand, as I said before, it's not a descriptive approach. It's not to say Jews have always believed, ABC. That is also different. But it's really what can we seriously, philosophically, rationally say about God in a Jewish sense. So what are answers that only Jews can give, as Sam said before. This is what defines actually theology in our book and in our point of view.
So you've just both given this sort of very compelling account of why theology talk matters when it comes to Judaism. You've talked a bit about the historical factors that are contributing to this flowering of the distinctively modern version of this theology. So you've made the case that this is not just a modern phenomenon, but you talked about the political factors, the social or religious factors, the educational factors. I'm not going to lie, Sam, I think I've done a lot of these conversations. This is the first time the term zoology has come up in one of these conversations about a JPS book. And you began to now talk about some of the ideas or some of the answers to questions that are being offered during this period. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about those. What are some of the big ideas, the big topics, the big questions, the big kind of visions of God or Jewish life that were important to the thinkers who were active in the period that you discuss in this book?
first of all, it's really about the academic approach to Jewish sources, which is quite interesting. So biblical criticism obviously comes up only in the 20th century in Jewish circles, but we have mid-19th century, we have already discussions of the Talmud, of like how does it work? This is the one of the biggest differences, of course, between Judaism and Christianity is the role of law, right? Inside the religion. That is discussed very heavily. How is it connected to God? How is God as a lawgiver functional in that definition of Judaism as a legal oriented religion? That is something that comes up very often. Then, of course, what are the consequences of the strict belief in a monotheistic God? It's not, again, it's not something that we are proud of. We believe in one God and they have three gods. This is really not the point. The point is, what does it mean to believe in one God? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for our, outlook on life if you say there's only one truth? Okay, so it's kind of hidden. It's somewhere out there. It's like in the old Lessing story that, with the two hands, the search for truth and the truth, and you take the search for truth. This is exactly the definition they come up, with for God. It's not that we know the truth, but we know there's only one truth. Just to give you one example of what's going on. Then, of course, Maimonides is still playing a big role in those discussions. Of course, maybe that is the official beginning of Jewish theology, that he came up with this list of 13 principles. They all try to to cope with that somehow. Say what is still relevant of those? How should we rebuild the list? We have at least 3 different texts that try to handle this. This example that Maimonides gives actually for a list of and again, it's not blind belief dogmas. It's just rational convictions. What is still there? This is something that interested him. And then what Sam mentioned before, the question of morality is, of course, very, very central in most of the sources. What does it mean? Why are we, for what reasons are we still, religious? If it's not only for the sake of tradition, for the sake of, not infuriate our fathers, it's just, we are, this is something very central. We are religious because we want to be moral people, and especially the legal, also, the Kantian, stream comes in, of course, the legal part of Judaism gives us exactly this possibility to be moral people according to a code of behavior. Those are, maybe Sam, those are the main themes actually that come up in the book.
Yeah, and I would add just one more, which is really at some level also that we haven't mentioned in 30 minutes yet, is the other core document of Jewish theology, which is the Siddur, right? The question of like what is the ritual life of the Jews, right? What are you doing in what the Germans call the cult, but Americans might call just sort of the service or the practice, or just sort of the synagogue service. And one of the reasons that the early reformers, and in fact one of the reasons that still today the Siddur, every movement of Judaism publishes its own Siddur. You go into any Jewish store, and there is a whole wall of Siddurim, right? Like it is so radically important that Koren and Art Scroll and the conservative movement and the Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement and the Humanist movement all publish their own Siddur, because it is a document that actually has so little to do with deed. The only thing you're doing is reciting it. It is all theology. It is all who we are, what we are, how we stand here as a people in front of God. So one of the things we see are again and again throughout the chapters are people are these wonderful thinkers engaging with the question of where does the service start? Like where does Jewish religious, like where does the liturgy begin? What are we supposed to say? What can we say? What do we feel comfortable saying? Should we only say things that come from the Bible? Should we also say things that the rabbis wrote? How do we prove that? Right? Do we feel comfortable? How responsible are we to things that are pre-Babylonian exile and post-Babylonian exile, things that are post-Talmudic and pre-Talmudic, right? These really like central questions that I think, for the most part, we kind of just assume. You walk into a synagogue, you pick up the Siddur, but actually, right, for those who understand what they're saying on the Hebrew side, and in fact, one of the cool things, we did not deal with this, and someone else can deal with this in later scholarship, but like in translations vary wildly of how they translate the Hebrew liturgy, and they're doing that from a theological perspective, right? What do they really want to convey to people in the language they understand? And so one of the fun things, I mean, that I think we see throughout this book is that also how these thinkers are translating these larger theological principles into, most of them were pulpit rabbis, and many of them wrote textbooks or wrote for their communities. What do they want their communities to say and believe and think?
So, it's really striking hearing both of you speak now, because these ideas and topics and questions are fascinating. The historical context that you have described is fascinating. And so I'm wondering, why then has the story that you tell in this volume gone untold for so long? Why have so many of the texts you present never been translated into English before? Why is this kind of formative part of modern Jewish life, modern Jewish history, modern Jewish thought been overlooked?
I'm going to jump in even before George answers you, which is to say, why is there no professor of Jewish theology at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America? There are lots of people who do theology. But one of the things that's striking is that there is almost no one, I think we counted maybe 2 or 3 people on earth, who hold something called a chair in Jewish theology. Even right, like there isn't there versus in my department, I'm at a Lutheran affiliated school, and there are 3 positions in Lutheran theology, right? Because the school was founded by Lutherans. So the understanding, and they are scholars just like anyone else. But the understanding is that what they're doing is their scholarship is oriented towards figuring out how Lutherans understand what God is doing from a Christian perspective. And so it's just a sort of striking sense that for whatever reason, I'll let George go into his theories as well, that there's just no one out there even using this term.
There's no way around. We have to mention, one of the tragic reasons for that is, of course, the Holocaust is sure. This is something that we shouldn't forget. At this point, there was a lively discussion on theology in Germany until the 1930s, even way into the Nazi rule. Leo Beck, just to mention one name, was also in our book. Is just a great theologian. He's written the gospel from a Jewish point of view in 38, I guess, something like that. So that is just in terms of history, one of the reasons, before we come to all the, reasons connected to the subject itself, it's just that, all the important texts, really all the important texts from the 19th century, early 20th century have been written in German, and you have to know German for that. And in Germany, there's no interest for Jewish theology, and in other countries, they don't know German. This is some of the things that's why this book is also so important, if I may say this, at this point, because we just translated these things that have just existed only in German so far, and that is because nobody was really discovered the depth of thought that is in those texts. So one of the things is really just this language problem. It's the same here in Israel. It's not only in the United States. It's also here where people are really interested in theology, but they just don't have the language skills. This is one of the problems. And the other thing is, of course, as I said in the beginning, people are afraid that it might be sound like Christianity, which is interesting, that Jews deal in theology, but that is exactly the heritage that we try to continue from our thinkers, is to say that of course we have to do this. We just have to do it differently. Theology in itself is not to blame, as exactly the German language is not to blame for what the Nazis did with it. It's just not. theology is not to blame for what Christians did with that. It's very important for Jewish identity to formulate a modern Jewish theology, as we see, because people do really the craziest things. To say just again, take an American thinker like Michael Bishograd, for example. This guy is a Barthian, right? I mean, it's like he's an Orthodox thinker, really imitating Christianity, or take Soloveitchik, what's the lonely? There's no loneliness in Judaism, right? I mean, this is really interesting, that this whole issue of self-sacrifice, I mean, there's a big need for that. So why has it been overlooked so far? In addition to the language problems, I think it's first of all a completely misunderstood need to be different from Christianity. That is still the major issue, and just they missed this point, that there could be a Jewish or there has been a Jewish theology over all these years, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I'm just to piggyback on that. I mean, people have been writing theological texts. I mean, there is, if you start to look for it, right? I mean, there are wonderful both 20th and mid-20th, late 20th, early 20th, and 21st century Jewish theologians. The question is sort of why academically, why in the larger discourse of Judaism, do we sort of shy away from the term, right? It's not that people aren't doing theology. Heschel was doing theology. Soloveitchik was doing theology. Art Green is doing theology. Shai Held is doing theology. There are so many, right, incredible theologians, and yet, right, this sense, Tamar Ross is doing theology, right? Like there is Judith Plaskow is doing theology. There are theologians. The question is sort of why this term, and I think both. George is exactly right, which is that the loss of the heritage really of European intellectual Judaism writ large in the middle of the 20th century. We lost the language that Europeans use, right? So if you had 10,000 Jewish scholars at German universities in theology departments, they would just feel more comfortable with this kind of language, right? So but American universities just don't do that. We have religious studies departments. With our one lone heritage of Germany, which is the Jewish Theological Seminar in New York, right? And then Israel has a different language as well, and Hebrew didn't adopt this language; it adopted sort of philosophia or storia. They sort of they Hebraicize different Latin or Greek terms, and so I think that certainly explains part of it. There is another, which is just the robustness of the conversation in. Let's say where liberal, non-Orthodox Judaism have gone, they've really separated in distinct ways. Orthodoxy has moved, of which I claim myself as one, has moved really into halacha, right? I like how many of us, so for those who are Orthodox listening, sat at college lunches where the only thing we talked about is what is kosher. That was it. Lunch after lunch after lunch after lunch is kashrut and kashrut and kashrut. Right, and then theology was kind of left to like your own devices, and liberal Judaism, right, from which has really moved into social activism, universalism, the vision of sort of the Jewish spirit and soul, and has moved away from any claim that those are divine. Has moved away. I've really felt uncomfortable with the sense that like any of these principles come from a God that we claim as ours. And I'm not saying either of these trends is right or wrong, but I think both of them do lend us to say that both of these groups are doing theology. Both of them do theology actively. But in my experience, the Orthodox have just said Maimonides is right and we're done with it, even though they don't live a Maimonidean life. And the left has done all this amazing theological work, but has sort of proclaimed that it doesn't need to have a faith in God, or not a faith. It doesn't need to be called by God. These are not answers to a God-given question. These are rational, right, universal moral questions. And so I think just because of these trends, you kind of lose the sense that they're actually pretty much having a continuous conversation through Jewish history. But for various reasons that we wanted, I'll just end on this. George and I, we want people to use this term. We love this term. We want people to recognize that they're doing this, to claim that they're doing this, for liberals and conservatives to both claim that they're doing this, and to feel really comfortable that they're part of this long-term, really, really millennia-long conversation, Jewish conversation.
So in a moment, we'll come back to that question of kind of what you want people to be doing today, how you want your volume to change the lives and thinking of kind of readers across the globe. Before we get there, though, we've been talking about these big developments, these big categories, these big ideas. The other thing that this book is a collection of is of particular people, of particular thinkers who wrote particular texts. And I was wondering whether each of you has a favorite thinker in the volume. Who are the kind of exciting or intriguing personalities whom readers will encounter here? And, for you, what makes those individuals exciting or intriguing?
Just also before I have an idea of how to answer a question, although it's really difficult because I actually love almost everybody in the book. That's why they are in there. It is a set of interesting figures in more sense than one, because also the translators, this is something we should actually mention. The translators are not technical translators that we, paid for. It's all of them are like very dear colleagues of ours. We ask, just to pick their favorite thinker from the 19th century and translate this text into. So what you have here is like really a double set of interesting figures. You have the leading scholars in Jewish studies right now, in Germany, in the United States, in Italy, even have translated those texts. So this is just something I want to mention because it really gives the book a double plus. In terms of I don't know. It's just too hard, and I don't want to be unfair to. But I think I picked two people that I myself translated, and one is Abraham Geiger, which is I just think one of the most underrated people in the 19th century at all. The guy is so interesting. First of all, he has had a very difficult life, a tragic life almost, and he produced so much, and he was such a pioneer. I mean, he was a pioneer in biblical criticism. Nobody liked him for that, not even the conservatives printed a review of his book on biblical criticism. He's the first one who really tackles the Talmud in a scientific way. He tries to explain how Talmudic law is related to biblical law in a way that has not been discussed before at all. Look, everybody knows Geiger as he's the founder of the Reform movement, whatever that means. There's no Reform movement in that sense, that, people would pay, their membership fees to Geiger or whatever, he's the founder in a real theological sense of the word, of this movement, because he's giving the movement its own theology, which is, largely forgotten today in the Reform movement in the US, but in the 19th century, Geiger was such a pioneer on so many fields and under so difficult and tragic circumstances that he would be my first, still my first candidate. So he's one of the more, well-known figures in the book, but not in terms of what he has written. This is something I discovered when we worked on the book, that even from Geiger, there are few collections in English, but not the most important texts actually are translated. So that is my choice.
So I think without question, maybe not without question, but more or less without question, Geiger really is the most important figure in the book, in that really just an incredible synthetic mind. And really, there is a reason that he goes on to be known, one of the few figures who's really widely known in the book, outside of maybe Solomon Schechter for conservative Jews, and so I think people should really that is the place to start. I will say hitting down on my love of zoology. I would actually take people to two places. One is to Hyman Steinthal, who's just this fascinating thinker, really interested in folk psychology and mythology, and the excerpt that we do from him is on Genesis, is on the vision of the Jewish creation of the world. And similar to that, a little ways down the book is Beno Yaakov, who is interested in archaeology and in Assyriology and in the questions of language. Where does this thinking come from? And these are what we mean by, like, we're trying to bring people, thinkers, Jews who love Judaism, who at some level are apologists for Judaism, only in the sense that they think Judaism deserves to exist and they love it and they want it to stick around, but will just face directly, right, the questions of, like, what's going on in the world? What are people discovering, right? How are we living in this world? And I think, and I just want to, like, say, everyone who watches this will be Jews, but Jews, it's really unusual to have a people still around who are so old, and who still are doing things that are similar. And I think we sometimes forget how extraordinary it is that we're still reading Mondays, Thursdays, Shabbos, Chags, coming up on Pesach, things that people were doing thousands of years ago. And that's really amazing. And so, like, there is no one around here who's like a Greek, who prays to Athena, and it's like, what are the classical archaeologists discovering about the newest, unearthed classical monument in the Peloponnese? Nobody's there doing that. But, like, the Jews are confronted by, like, an archaeology about themselves. Who are we, right? I mean, the minute Israel starts excavating around the Temple Mount, it's like, there are mikvahs around here. This is incredible, right? What is the archaeology telling us about our own people and what we're doing? And all these people literally coming this week, 2,500 years ago, 2,300 years ago, to the temple, going to a mikvah. The synagogue down the road from me just built a new mikvah. Like, that's extraordinary, this continuity and yet distinction, right? And so I think one of the things we just love about these figures is that, like, I mean, everyone from Geiger to these later figures are just fascinated by who the Jews used to be and who we should be. And to give a small sort of subtle reference to a new JPS book that just came out by Daniel Hartman. But this sense of he's doing a theology there and trying to figure out who we should be coming from who we were. So are these thinkers.
Well, I appreciate both of you bringing this into the present. By the way, for I think both the Jewish viewers of this conversation, but I think also the non-Jewish viewers of this conversation. I think that these are topics and books that matter to a wide audience, and I'd love to sort of end by thinking a little bit about that. What do the first 100 years of modern Jewish theology give us today? Why do these first 100 years matter? What can 21st century readers learn? What will 21st century readers learn from the ideas and experiences and stories and texts and figures whom they'll encounter in your book?
I mean, like, it is so relevant. I mean, it is much more relevant than I thought I really thought we would just, compile something that is representing our great love for the 19th century, Sam and mine, right? And all this. And I realized that it is completely relevant for what we do today. And if only in the sense that there have been people who thought about exactly the same questions that we have, to think about today, as everybody knows, we live in a time of crisis. And crisis is demanding answers, right? And if we are interested, I mean, that's a question, of course, but if we are interested in giving a Jewish answer, whatever that means, okay? So we have to deal with theology. We have to see what people have, thought about this before, how people approach the same problems that we have to cope with today, and just think about whatever the corona pandemic, what would be a Jewish answer? There have been so many ethical questions to solve. Or now what's going on in Israel right now today? This is a theological question of the first rate. I mean, this is something that, what is the highest value of Judaism? Self-sacrifice or the saving of lives? really without going into politics at all. I'm just saying, is if you can save a life, isn't that something that theologically Judaism would demand of us, or is it something that could be neglected and we can just, sacrifice people for a whatever higher sense? In Israel, there's something going on right now that everybody uses messianic as a curse word. This is something that, it just wouldn't happen if people would read our book, it's just, it's just crazy, to give a really practical example. Everybody's talking about the messianic right that leads us somewhere or whatever. Messianic for those guys is the absolute opposite of the curse word. This is something, it's one of the greatest contributions that Judaism, Jewish theology made to civilization, to humanistic culture at all. The hope for a better future inside a religious belief, that is something not for the other world, as in Christianity, but in this world, Tikkun Olam, this is something that, if they would read our book, they would know that at least there's another option to refer to messianism, or to see messianism as something that is necessarily fanatic or right-wing or anything like that. Just to give a concrete example, of what's going on here.
And a concrete example from America, which is the question of peoplehood, right? So you have so many, how do you relate to a people in this faraway country, right, that's undergoing this extraordinary, terrible experience, and then also relate to an American people for whom you are equal citizens, right? What is the nature of Jewish peoplehood itself? That's really, you can say, oh, it's just simply an ethnic question, it's your mother's descent, but no one really, that doesn't answer, that gives you one small sort of petty scientific, I'm more related to George than to other people, I suppose, in some kind of abstract genetic sense, but nobody really lives their lives that way, right? And so what we see in the book is these are people confronted by this exact same question. How am I like the Jews in all these other countries, and yet also a citizen of the country in which I am? This is a perplexing, contemporary, endlessly relevant question, made more so by the fact if some Jews are going through an extraordinarily terrible experience, and I am going through my own experience. What is the relationship? What is not the relationship? How can I voice a concern? How can I voice a support? Right? Again, not on politics, but really on this. What are we called? Are we called by something? Is there something beyond us? Right? And these are theological questions from which people say Jews have this answer, Jews have that answer. Our book provides thinkers who have already been doing this and working through this. And then also, just a plug for the scholarship, the footnotes give you sources, right? And Sefaria lets you go to them and to really see that, like, this is a robust conversation Jews have been having for a very, very long time, right? What is the responsibility of communities far away to help hostages who are Jews? What is the responsibility of Jews to their local community in giving tzedakah versus giving tzedakah to Jews far away? These are perpetual questions, endlessly relevant in the modern period, in the contemporary period, endlessly relevant in our book, that are, at their core, we want to argue, theological questions.
Well, there's so much more that I think we could think about here if we had more time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to bring the conversation to a close. But George, Sam, I just want to thank you so much for speaking with me today, for editing this collection, and really for recovering and opening up this formative period in Jewish theology. To those of you watching this, if you want to order your copy of this book, if you haven't done so yet, and if you have done so yet, to order more copies of the book, you can visit our website, jps.org. There's also going to be a link in the description of this video here with information about discount codes you can use. Thank you, George. Thank you, Sam, for thinking with all of us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.